Thank you, Sandra. I would like to thank also David for inviting me here, and thank you all for staying up until the end of the conference to listen to me. As it was said, I'm a PhD student both at the University of Lausanne and also at Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne. My dissertation is on the concept of merit goods or merit wants, which is a concept that was invented by Richard Musgraves, an American German-born economist you might know. But today I'm going to talk to you about public goods. Why? Because I think that this is kind of, for me, prior work in order to better understand the specificity of the concept of merit goods. So what I plan to do broadly in my thesis is a first part where I reconstruct the historical debates surrounding the concept of merit goods from its kind of prehistory to the failure to integrate public economics as the concept of public good did. And in a second part of the thesis, I plan to construct a new framework to assess some merit goods, and drawing mostly on the criticism of the new welfare economics foundation of American public finance, and also on contemporary political philosophy. So that's kind of a very large thesis project. I don't know where I'll end up at the end of the thesis, but for now this is kind of, again, as I said, preliminary work, as the concept of merit good is, as I say, kind of a sister concept to the concept of public good. Without the concept of public good that we wouldn't have a concept of merit goods. So that's why I need to kind of retrace a bit this history. Something else I wanted to say before starting the formal presentation of the paper is that some of the ideas I will present might seem trivial to you, but they're, especially the authors I quote, are partially unknown to most of the scholars with which I engage in Europe. And so you probably have a more, some of you, intimate relationship with those authors, and I'd very much like if you could tell me if I'm completely off the mark or foreign to you of my reading because of this spatial, temporal, and cultural distance from which I read those texts. Okay, so I plan, well, a simple plan of the presentation, which is also the plan of the paper. First, I want to present what are the goals, and then I will cover briefly Musgraves' writing on social goods. And then this leads me to consider something that was not maybe directly assessed by Musgraves, which is the size of the group dimension. And this allows me to maybe hint at some improvement of the summary table that Musgraves and Musgraves invented to present the typology of goods. Also, notice here that I said that the title is on public goods. As you might know, Musgraves used the concept of social goods, or first social wants, and then he switched to social goods. Here I won't make any distinction because other authors talk about public goods or collective goods to talk about mostly the same thing. He uses the concept of social goods, but here I will just use them interchangeably here. So first, my thesis is quite simple. There is indeed a widespread textbook definition of public goods as being non-rival and non-excludable, and this definition was first clearly stated by Richard Musgraves, although this is generally not acknowledged in textbooks, obviously, but also not acknowledged in most of the kind of specialized articles on public finance or public economics in general. Furthermore, Musgraves and his wife Peggy Musgraves, in a textbook that they co-wrote, first publication was 1973, called Public Finance in Theory and Practice. They proposed this 2x2 table representation of the typology of goods that follow their two criteria definition, which is not surprising since Musgraves invented this definition. Obviously, there are two binary criteria, so That leads to 4 different possibilities, and this is the table. And this table, again, is found in many, many textbooks, introductory textbooks, I didn't find any reference to Musgrave on this. Notice that, so this is the first version of it that is in the textbook in 73. So they use, those are types of good or cases, 4 different cases. They're not examples of good. Now in textbooks, most of the time you will find example of goods there. The first instance that I found of this, of putting examples, is in a paper by Ostrom in 1977. But if you know any earlier account of this, I'd be happy, because I couldn't survey everything. So for those who are not familiar with this simple public economics framework, the idea is that number 1 would describe goods for which exclusion is feasible and for which the consumption of which are rival. Those are, let's say, pure private goods. And then at the opposing corner, number 4, you have goods which are non-excludable, non-rival. Typically, we would put national defense in this category, and then anything like bread as pure private goods. And in between, you have intermediate or mixed categories of good. The ones consumption non-rival but excludable would be either club goods or toll goods, and goods for which exclusion is not feasible but consumption is rival are sometimes called common pool resources, like fish stocks, for example. Okay. So, knowing that Musgrave invented this definition, then my first question is why was no recognition of his authorship on this? Well, the first explanation is that textbooks are generally bad in historical contextualization and authorship recognition. They generally only quote the giants of the past, and since Musgrave didn't win a Nobel Prize, that might explain why he's not quoted on this specific issue. Also, you could say, I labeled this Musgrave's humility because he wrote part of the history of public economics himself, and he doesn't refer to himself on this topic, and since he's recognized as one of the scholars of the history of public finance, then he might be responsible for his kind of lack of acknowledgement. And a third part of the answer, or third hypothesis, would be that actually textbooks are not what you could call state-of-the-art technical models. There's a different conceptualization of the issues of public goods in textbooks that you find in specialized scientific papers, and maybe the history of the discipline is the history of those scientific thinking, and most papers in public economics would use Samuelson's mathematical definition, and that might explain also why this definition of non-rival, non-excludable, which is more qualitative, is not acknowledged in the historical papers. So I have 3 goals with this paper. First, I'd like to fill this small gap in the history of economic thought literature on the evolution of Musgrave's writing on public goods toward the crystallization found in textbooks. Note that it's not so a textbook study or textbook analysis per se. I'm only studying the history of one concept that is found in many textbooks. Also, a second goal would be to assess the specificity of Musgrave's approach to public goods. And this is especially striking if we compare it to Buchanan's, for example, conceptualization. So Musgrave focuses on free riding, market failure, and public goods are taught inside public finance and are not kind of generic concept as we use them nowadays in public economics. And finally, reviewing the discussion briefly on the size of the group, might allow me to suggest a small improvement of this 2x2 table that I've shown you that is used in textbooks by adding a size of the group variable. So here, what I want to do is to briefly reconstruct Musgraves' evolution on public goods or on social goods. This is the elements that I pick up in his papers are sometimes not the central parts, but it's only a rational reconstruction of the elements that I want to focus on. So his first paper, which was published in '39, is a critique of the voluntary exchange tradition in public finance. And there his main point is that the voluntary exchange assumption is unrealistic when the number of agents is large. And so there's, in a footnote, the intuition of the issue behind free riding, which is already there in '39. Note that Musgrave doesn't use the expression of free rider or free riding. There's a book called Free Riding by Tuck, an American called Tuck, I think, which from Harvard, a philosopher. And he says that the first to use the expression free rider in public finance was Stigler in the 1966 edition of the Theory of Price. But actually, as Marciano noted recently, Buchanan uses it in his 1964 paper on what economists should do. And I checked, and he reuses it in 65, in 66, 67. So I think Tuck is wrong, and it was probably Buchanan who imported the concept in public finance, talking about the spec of the free rider in '64. Yeah. So if you know of any earlier instance, because I know the term was used before in discussions in labor union movements and in the labor literature, but in public finance, it's probably Buchanan '64, the first instance of it. So another aspect that is discussed by Musgrave in '39 is that public services provide joint or indivisible benefits. This is not specifically new to Musgrave. This was found already in the old continental public finance literature, namely in Sachs, Wicksell, Lindahl, Mazzola, Cassel. You find this idea already there. And then he hints at what he calls his planning approach, which is kind of an alternative to the voluntary exchange assumption or voluntary exchange theory. So 2 years later, in a reply to Neil, he precises a bit further what he wants, and he says that the free rider market failure follows from the recognition on the part of the agent of the impossibility of being excluded. That's the idea that is found there, and also that something that is, I think, quite new compared to those continental texts is that collective wants here and private wants are both individual wants, so they're both assessed by the individual. They're not, the collective wants are not wants assessed by some global collective Geist or state entity. So Musgrave immigrates in 1933, does a PhD at Harvard. Then he went on to work at the Fed for about 10 years and goes back to academia, and in the 1950s work on his theory of public finance. There's a kind of a, he presents a paper, I think it's at the American Economic Association meeting in 1955, which was published in '57, in which he describes the structure of his normative theory in 3 branches. And then in this paper, the logical reasoning is that for public goods, since the same quantity of goods is consumed by all, therefore nobody is excluded, therefore preferences cannot be revealed, therefore the market fails. So that's the reasoning. And as you might remember, for those of you who are familiar with this literature, this obviously the same quantity of goods is consumed by all. This is kind of the literal translation in words of Samuelson's definition which is found in the 1954 paper on a pure theory of public expenditure, or the pure theory of public expenditure. So the final version of the theory is published in 59. In it, Musgrave defines public wants. There are two types of wants, the social wants and the merit wants, as I talked to you about earlier. And the social wants, or the collective wants if you want, contrary to merit wants, for social wants you can apply the benefit principle. That means that the people who are benefiting from it can pay for it, and the demand is expressed by voting. Basically, that's what he says in there. Also, so he defines social wants as satisfied by services that must be consumed in equal amounts by all. And we also find the idea that non-exclusion leads to the fact that voluntary price payments cannot be expected, and therefore the market fails. So since agents know that they cannot be excluded, they're not going to pay for something that they know they can get for free. That's the idea. But then in a footnote, Musgrave says, well, actually, for social wants to arise, we must combine both the condition of joint consumption and the inapplicability of the exclusion principle. So here we already have the idea that there are two criteria that must combine. It's made clear in a paper presented in 1966 in Biarritz, which is published in 69. Here, Musgrave switched his viewpoint from talking about wants to talk about goods, because he recognized that there are objective characteristics of the goods. And so he says that there are two distinct features or characteristics that need not to coincide in social goods. And he renames them non-rivalness in consumption and non-excludability from consumption. So this is the standard definition that is found in most textbooks, and it dates from 1969, I think. Okay, so in the textbook with his wife, Public Finance in Theory and Practice, in the third chapter on social goods, here they write that there are two distinct causes of market failure: the impossibility of exclusion, which leads to problems of preference revelation when the number is large, and the non-rivalness in consumption, which is the cause of the fact that exclusion is undesirable even if technically feasible. Why? Because you can provide the good at zero marginal cost to another user, therefore you should provide it to everyone for free. And so there's a slight emphasis on what is the change of emphasis, on what is the more basic cause, because in their normative framework, what is important are the kind of policy recommendations. And here the policy recommendation in this simplistic framework follows from the non-rivalness when the two causes combine, because here it says those public goods have to be provided freely to all, whether they be excludable or not. As earlier in the previous writings, I think the more basic cause for Musgrave was the impossibility of non-exclusion. And then we find the table that I shown you earlier, which is called the summary table, because it just summarized the discussion in the third chapter. So now what I'd like to do is to consider another dimension of the problem, which is the size of the relevant group. Why considering this dimension? First, I think there's an apparent paradox here, because Musgrave was not mainly responsible for the development of the theory along this line, but in a sense it is central in understanding the specificity of his conceptualization of public goods. Also, it explains part of the development of the theory in the 1960s, which is embodied in the table, but it's not fully embodied. That is why I think it can hint at an improvement of this little table. So the first step to unfold this paradox is to distinguish three levels of this size variable that I reconstruct. or if you want two questions or two thresholds. There's the issue of small numbers and then large numbers and very large number. So there's a distinction in terms of phenomena between a small number interaction and a large number. And then there's also a different policy recommendation that follows from large number but local population and very large number national or global population. So here Musgraves' contribution is twofold. As I said earlier, he said that the market failure, free riding market failure rested on the assumption of a large number, but he didn't really discuss the matter further. And moreover, he kind of initiated a new sub-branch of public finance, which is Fiscal Federalism, and where thorough reflection on how community structures impact on the optimal allocation of goods, it took place there. But Musgrave was interested into a broad number of criterion in fiscal federalism, not only efficiency but also equity. But here, focusing on this summary table, my interest is only on this efficiency restoring, because this table only takes into account the goods that should be provided to restore the market failure inefficiency. It's not which goods should be provided according to some equity criterion. So knowing this, why was Musgrave not mainly responsible for the development of the theory along this line? Well, the first obvious explanation is that science evolved and then there were some enterprise to generalize and to fill in the holes in the theory of public goods. This was done by Olson, Buchanan, Thibault. They picked up on what Samuelson and Musgrave had done. So this is kind of the obvious internal explanation. And then there's the external explanation, which is that the political issues evolved over the years with an interest in central planning, which peaked probably in the 1950s. They came more interested into metropolitan governments issue and decentralization in the 60s. So here I won't give you all the arguments. I'm just giving you some examples of those attempts at generalizing along this size of the group by incorporating the size of the group variable. Here in the famous book by Olson, 65, he clearly says that most collective goods can only be defined with respect to some group. One good goes to one group of people, another to another group. One may benefit the whole world, another to specific people. So it's really clear here that we have to take into account the group or the size of the group. Also, two important papers by Buchanan in the 60s on this issue. The first one is the economic theory of clubs. And Buchanan assumes that exclusion is possible. In this case, you can define a club as a voluntary organization which provides a partially non-rival good to a group of optimal size. So if you don't have a possibility for if exclusion is not an issue, then you need something else to constrain the optimal provision, and then he comes up naturally with this optimal size of the group. So in this model, as you know, the collective good, the Samuelson collective good, is a club good of infinite number of users, and a private good would be a club good of zero optimal number of users. Another very interesting paper by Buchanan published the same year is called Ethical Rules, Expected Value in Large Number. And in this paper, Buchanan explains the difference between the small number interaction and the large number interaction. He says that in small groups, individuals, they expect to influence others and they behave strategically, they can bargain, but there's no strategic behavior or no bargaining taking place in large groups. People treat others as part of nature or as a background. Hence, the large number dilemma, which according to Buchanan is equivalent to the free rider dilemma, is not the same thing as the prisoner's dilemma. even though this in the literature, in the textbooks, you sometimes find this association. It is a much bigger problem because it's not only a matter of communication here. It follows from the fact that there's really a large number of people interacting. So those are for example, this paper allows us to understand better this distinction between small number and large number, kind of the threshold that happens somewhere qualitatively in between. Another strand of literature interesting for this size of the group is a paper by Charles Thibault, which was a student of Musgraves at Michigan State University. He's known mostly for his famous 1956 paper, but this is another paper published in '61, which was presented at a conference organized by Buchanan in '59. And there he says that public goods have a spatial extent on the benefit sides, and the benefits may not accrue equally to all residents of a region. So those were examples of the kind of generalization that took place in the 60s to include this size dimension. Another explanation of why Musgraves was not mainly responsible for this new development is, I think, the fact that if you don't think in terms of objective goods, but you take this externality or spillover conceptualization, you're kind of led more naturally to consider the size dimension, because if you think of an externality, you obviously think of the extent of the externality, as Kafoglis and Buchanan say, for example, in this paper in '63. There are many examples of this. Also in this paper, very important in political science by Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren in '61, they say playground creates externalities which are neighborhood-wide in scope, while national defense activities benefit the whole nation and affect many outside it. Thus, for each public good, there corresponds some public. And finally, the third explanation of why Musgraves was not mainly responsible is I think, quite simple, is the fact that Musgraves had a solution. For him, state intervention was the solution. It was not the challenge. And since he thought that exclusion was not feasible for most of the public goods, therefore price charging was impossible. End of the story. Although, since Buchanan assumed that exclusion was most of the time feasible, then he came up with this club goods model. And according to Buchanan, it gives a more, it helps to understand better Musgraves' approach if you contrast it with Buchanan. For Buchanan, took this as a challenge, the idea that market failure entails public provision, and he wanted to ask the question, is coercive collective action inevitable, as you know? And so, well, if exclusion is possible, then you can get club goods where you don't need state intervention. But if exclusion was an issue, then maybe you could adjust property rights to allow exclusion, and then you're brought back to a small number of interactions. But if this was not feasible, if collective action was inevitable, then by requiring unanimity or quasi-unanimity, you preserve freedom and allow bargaining, and so you're brought back again to something that would be equivalent of a small number interaction. So you're out of this large number interaction dilemma, which brings us to the public good provision or state provision. So here's the summary table. So what I did is I took the size variable as a binary variable to make it simple, and then I just split the tables here, the cells, the 3 of the 4 cells here, to account for this distinction in terms of optimal efficiency restoring first best policy response. Obviously, it's a kind of a very simple framework, which if you want to be critical, you can always argue that there's some implicit institutional structure behind this. but it's meant to introduce students to the topics in public finance. So what examples could we find here between large common pool resources and small ones? Well, if you take the example of the management of a stock of fish, then the policy response wouldn't be the same for managing the stock in a small lake and a large ocean. In the case of the small lake, you could have the residents surrounding the lake who would settle an agreement together. If you take the other examples of mixed good, there's obviously a distinction between large clubs and small clubs. If you take the example of a national highway, which would be a large club, and then small club would be a swimming pool. Again, the solution in terms of which government should be doing what is not the same for those two kinds of mixed goods. And if you take the pure public good example, you could say, well, street lighting would be a local public good, and national defense would be a national or a global public goods. So you can discuss whether it should be national here, the category, or global. There's been a discussion in the past 10 years on so-called global public goods. So what were my motivations for adding the size of the group variable? Well, first, I think it would improve the table by giving it a more precise typology to students in a normative perspective without being too confusing. As you probably noticed, it's somehow a fusion of the two typologies of Buchanan's one and Musgraves one. Why? Because in his book, The Demand and Supply of Public Goods, Buchanan used two criteria, which are indivisibility and the size of the group. And I think that indivisibility is equivalent to non-rivalness. And so you end up with two typologies of two criteria, one of which is the same. So if you fuse them, you get three criteria. And I think they're quite independent. If you take, for example, if they would not be independent, there wouldn't be any distinction, for example, between small clubs and local public goods, right? So, and I think that the swimming pool is not the same thing as street lighting. There's really a distinction here to be made, because you really cannot exclude people from street lighting, but you can exclude people from a pool by just putting a fence around it. And also Buchanan he doesn't use binary variables. He uses a plane, a two-dimensional plane. So you could also, here I took the table, but you could also argue that take those three variables as continuous variables, and then you would put the goods in a three-dimensional space on this continuous space. And then finally, I think it respects somehow Musgraves' project, because in a preface to a book, Musgrave and Musgrave in 2003 said that the non-rival availability of benefits to all members of the benefiting group is the essential, or at least an essential characteristic of public goods. So they agreed, at least at that point, that the size of the group or the community definition was important for public goods. So just to sum up what I said, well, what's the specificity of Musgraves' conceptualization? Well, he coined a standard definition of public goods, and Musgrave and Musgrave provided this first table representation. Musgrave stressed, especially compared to the previous authors, on non-exclusion as a cause of free riding. And he also highlighted the jointness dimension, which would become non-rivalry. But in his normative framework, if the two causes combine, then the kind of more basic one is non-rivalry, because it leads to the policy recommendation that the goods have to be made available freely to all. So as I stressed, discussing this difference between small number and large number, drawing on Buchanan's precisions, we see that in public finance for Musgrave, state provision of public goods is the only realistic solution when the number is large. And if we kind of continue the project, we get to the idea that this level of government responsibility for the provision depends on the spatial extent on the benefit sides derived from the goods and services. Thank you.